Hey everybody, welcome back to .NET on Azure, the Beginner Series. So in the last episode, you saw really just a general overview of what cloud computing is and how to set up your machine to start developing .NET applications on Azure. And so right now, we're going to take that first step. We are going to deploy the Munson's Pickle and Preserves Review application. Top notch. Who can believe it? We're going to preserve this app. We're going to deploy this app to Azure. It's a Blazor server app. It writes the databases. We're going to get this from our machine up to Azure, the basics. We're starting somewhere, and then we'll move on throughout this series. So, very first thing that we need to do is create the app service and the SQL database, put them on our machine so we can develop, and then we'll deploy. All right. So if you remember last time, we came up with our naming conventions for our services that we'll have running. And it's going to be type of service. And here, for example, our resource group is going to be RG dash application name. Here it's going to be Munson dash where it exists, East US in this case, the development environment, dev, and an instance. So we'll try to adhere to that as best we can as we go throughout. So consistency is key here more than anything else. So the very first thing that we're going to want to do is create an app service. And so app services are mainly just websites. And so what you can do here is host web APIs with them. You can host Blazor servers apps, you can host MVC apps, you can host it back on .NET Framework, you can host it on .NET on Linux, you can host .NET on Windows. Really, our full gamut of things that we want to do with our .NET applications. So to create it, we're going to go through the Azure portal first. We're going to do it all manually, and as we get along in our episodes, we're going to find out how we can do it in a CI/CD way with GitHub Actions. But that's further on down. First, what we want to do is we want to know how we can do it manually to get some understanding of what all goes on behind it. So the very first thing you have to decide on is where we want to put it, the resource group. A resource group is really just a big collection of where things go. And we want to put it into our Munson East US one. Great. And then next we want to give it a name. And so this name is also going to be where we access the app as well. So whatever we name it, we're going to be able to access that name.azurewebsites.net. And so the preferred nomenclature would be app dash name of application dash, and I'm going to also call it name of application dash web. So I know it's a website. Eventually we're going to create a web API as well. So Munson dash web dash where it exists, East US environment 001. So it's quite long, but when I look at it, I can tell what it is. What I want it to live as, whether it's just code, whether I'm going to put it into a Docker container, and whether on Linux or Windows, or a static web app. So I'm going to say this is going to be code, because I'm going to actually deploy it up directly. I'm not going to be putting it in a Docker and running it. And then I have a whole slew of things I can run it in. I could run .NET, which is what we're going to do, and I'm going to be running .NET 7, the latest and greatest. But I could also go all the way back and run some .NET frameworks like 4.8, even not down to 3.5. And if I wanted to do different languages, I could do Go, Java, Node, and PHP, Python, and so on. .NET 7 is the one that we'll choose. And then we can find out or determine where we want to have things. So I don't necessarily need to put my app in the same region as where my resource group. I'm going to, though. East US. And then finally, I want to create a service plan around that. So the web app exists within a service plan. And the service plan is what determines, one, your overall pricing, but two, the overall memory and CPU power that exists for it. And you can have more than one web app within a service plan. And then you can scale up or scale down the service plan as you need to. So I'm going to create a brand new one. And I'm going to call it ASP for App Service Plan. And then I'm going to call it Munson. And I'm going to leave it at that because I'm eventually going to have both this web app in here and then a web API. And then East US Dev 001. So that's my new app service plan I'm going to create. And then whether it would be zone redundant, which I don't have right now. And then I'm going to review and create it. And so this is going to take a little bit to spin up. As it goes through, the first step was just to validate everything as I wanted. It'll submit the deployment, and eventually Azure will go through, provision everything for me, and then I will be able to get at it. So while that's going, the next thing I'm going to want to do is create actually a private dashboard so I can see all my resources at it. And so I'm in the Azure portal here. And in the Azure portal, I can hit create from the beginning of it, and we'll just say Munson's Pickles. I could put different tiles on it if I wanted to, but for now I'm going to just create it blank. And so what I'm going to do is put all the resources I create for my Munson's Pickles onto here so I can just access them very quickly. So now I'm going to want to go through, search for my resource group. Here's my resource group, and so what I can do is hit this little pin up top, pin it to the dashboard, and I'll see here is Munson's Pickles, pin it, go back out to my dashboard, and now I can see that it's here. Great. And most important is that my app service and my web app, overall, the plan has been deployed. So now I can see that it's within it. So now, of course, this Munson's Pickles and Preserves both has the web app, which we already have out there. We have the infrastructure. We haven't deployed the code yet, but it also has a database behind it. So that's the next thing that we want to do. We want to create and deploy a SQL database. And so I should mention really quickly how I'm getting at everything. The portal has a search for search various different services. And so I can go in here and just type in SQL, and it'll bring up everything that matches SQL. That way I don't have to go through create and then search through everything that the create brings up for me, which is nice. It's just a quick shortcut to go through. So I'm going to create a new service, an Azure SQL database, create that, and then same thing as before. Going through, picking which resource group I want it to live in. So it's going to live in Munson, East US, and then give it a name. And so it's called SQLDB Munson East US Dev 001. And now I have to pick out a SQL server for it. So that's create new. And then I have to think of what the prefix for a SQL server name is. So I think, lucky for me, it's SQL Server. I already have it written down. And I'll include a link of where we can find all of the application prefixes documented, and I'll include it in the show notes. So we'll call it SQL Server Munson 001, located in East US. And then I want to use both SQL and Azure AD to get at it. I'm going to set the SQL Server admin as me, my account from the Azure Active Directory. And then I'm going to also create a server admin. And I'm going to create the server admin and call it Munson. And I also went ahead and created what hopefully is a strong password. Paste that in and it passes. Great. So back to the overall database creation. I have a new SQL Server, which I'm only calling SQL Server Munson 001. So I'm going to change my database name to adhere to that. So here I'm not saying dev or East US. Again, I'm just being consistent within itself as best I can. And then what I can say is, what do I want it to be? What kind of SQL Server do I want it to be? And what I want to point out here is I can make it actually serverless, which means I'm billed differently. And when the SQL Server hasn't been used for a while, it goes all the way down to 0. The server kind of gets removed from it, and I'm not billed when I'm using it, which is great for development purposes. And it tells me how much it thinks it'll cost. I'll apply that. And then I'll just say I'm going to use locally redundant storage. And I think go to networking, and this is actually pretty important. I want to create a connectivity method of a public endpoint so I can access it from the outside world. And I want to make sure that other Azure services, such as my app service, can access it. And I also, for my machine, I might want to go out and get at it so I can just see what kind of data is at it, if I can run regular SQL statements against it. So I'm going to want to add my current IP address too. So this is important as well. So I'm opening up firewall rules against it. All right, so everything else looks good. So I can just do an overall review and create, which gives me a summary of what everything is. And then I'll create it. So again, this is something that you'll probably only do once or twice. It's pretty limited once, and a lot of times maybe an IT admin will do it for you. But it's important to know what all goes in behind it, especially like the firewall rules. Now, so this deployment is going to kick off and take a little bit to get through. But once it does finish, we're going to take the connection string for it, bring it down to our app, and then run it to make sure everything locally runs and can talk to the SQL Server in Azure, and then push our web application up to Azure. So let's take a look at what our code is for our web app. And so I have a Blazor server web application, and it pretty much is exactly what you would expect a forms over data application to look like. In the program.cs, what I'm doing is I am newing up what I'm calling the pickle DB context, which uses entity framework. And if I go ahead and I look at that, it's about what you'd expect. It just has a bunch of DB sets for several products, which will model my tables. And these tables just look pretty normal. An ID, name, description, URLs for the photos of my various products, and then linking out for the relationships between the product has a product type, the product has reviews to go along with it. Very simple entity framework stuff. All right, so let's check on our deployment, and it's still running through. All right, so once the deployment is done, it'll give you a pop-up saying, I'm good to go. And I can go to the resource and check it out. All right, it gives me things such as server name. I can actually go and view the connection strings and so on. And I can slide it out. Let's go to the dashboard, refresh, and I can see the SQL database here. And I can see things such as, what's nice, a query editor. So I can edit everything locally. And you see, one thing here is that this IP address needs to be added to my firewall. Now you're saying, well, Matt, you did it before when you're creating the database. This is a unique thing that happens sometimes where the IP address needs to be, there's several IP addresses that sometimes access it through the portal. And so what I'll just go through is back over to the SQL Server, search for a network, and then I can add a firewall rule. I'll just call it new client. Give it a start IP and an end IP. It's different than the one that was from before. Save it. And this is how I go through and open up holes in the firewall for various IPs to it. And again, you're only going to want to do this when you're doing through development work. For production work, you're going to want to keep this locked down. And the other thing I want to show really quick is the exception down here. And this is to allow other Azure services to access the server. So this we want to have checked, and this way our app service can hit the Azure SQL. All right, so if I go back to the database, I should be able to run my query editor, and now I can get to it. And there's no tables or anything in it quite yet because we haven't run our app. So what I need to do is grab my connection strings. And here is the one for .NET. Everything is shown to me all from the portal, helps me get up and running. And what I'm going to do is just pop it into VS Code so I can edit things nicely and quickly so I can put it in. So what it does new up the user ID for me, but I still have to put my own password in. All right, and then after that, I do not need anything that else gives me, like the multiple active result sets or such. So what I'll do is I'll just get rid of that. And then this I can use as my connection string. And so where I'm going to put that is I'm going to put that into the .NET secrets. I can open this up and I can just do .NET user secrets init. All right, we're good to go. We have that created, and I'm going to do .NET user secrets set, and I'll call it connection strings, and we'll say this is going to be Munson SQL DB, and then set it. Good, there it is. If I go back into Visual Studio, I should also be able to see it through the connected services, my secrets.json file, and there it is. So connection strings, Munson DB, Munson SQL DB, and now I want to get at it. So I'm going to change. Right here, that's highlighted. All I'm doing is pulling that out of the configuration, putting that into a variable, and then when I call out and new up my DB context, I'm passing that in, and also saying, you know what, retry it on failure if need to be. And then in my various services, I'm injecting in the pickle DB context, and then just grabbing things and running with it. And so let's run this. And so it's possible I might get another error exception saying that my IP address isn't added yet. So let's run it and see what happens. All right, great. So we're up, we're running. Everything worked just by using regular entity framework, pointing it over at SQL Server, using the connection string that we built up. And so I also have, real quickly to show, a DB initializer that just goes through and says, you know what, there's no products in there. Let's create them all. And then they show up for me. So my dill pickles, there they are, the first review. They pack a punch. I can add a review. They are delicious. Save it, refresh it, and there it shows up. So real quickly, let's just go back, look in Azure to make sure they show up in our query editor. So I'm going to log in as me. Again, refresh the table view over on the left, and I can see now I actually have stuff in here, tables. Just select the top 1,000 rows, and there everything is down here. Dill pickles, deliciously dill. Look at the reviews. And again, they are delicious. All right, good. Our local environment is talking up to Azure SQL. So the next thing we need to do is deploy our local environment up to App Service and get that talking to Azure SQL, and then we should be good, right? Right? So let's do that. Back over to Visual Studio. And what Visual Studio gives you, it gives you a way to talk with Azure and do deployments, one-offs, by right-clicking and then selecting Publish. And so part of it, when you're installing the whole Azure workload, you're able to then select, you know what, I want to publish to Azure, and then be able to pick where I want to publish. And so when we created the app service, we called it a Windows app service, and we did code. And so part of that is saying, right here, you know what, I'm going to say I'm deploying to a Windows version of app service with my code. Great. So I'll hit next, and now it's going to ask me, you know what, let's go out and find who and where. So what's happening here is actually a good point, is that it cannot find my subscription right now because I need to log in and make sure Visual Studio knows where my subscription is. And so in order to do that, it's underneath the File menu. Go down to Account Settings. And then right here, I have to add my account underneath All Accounts. Go add it. And it picked up who I was logged in on Windows under. It'll probably want me to sign in again. And then we should be good. All right. So I'll go and create another Azure Publish profile. Same as before. And you can see it picked up my subscription name this time. And now it's giving me a bunch of resource groups to deploy to. And I want to pick out the Munson East US, the web one that we created before. Hit next. And I'm going to say, you know what, I'm going to publish a publish profile. So it's important to note right here that I'm not actually publishing anything. Instead, I'm creating a publish profile. It's from this screen that I'm actually going to push it up to Azure with. And so all I'm saying is here is what my release configuration is, what my target framework is, and so on, where I want it to go to. Defaults usually are pretty good. Hit publish. And what it's going to do is going to go out, make sure everything's good, and then push it up to Azure. So let this run. All right. So once it's deployed, it'll open up the web apps homepage for us. And it's failed to start. And that's because we don't have the SQLDB connection string put up into our app settings within Azure. So in order to do that, I'll browse back over to the Azure portal, and then underneath the configuration area of settings, open that, scroll down to connection strings, enter a new connection string, and then I will put in what we're calling it. And it happens to be connection strings, Munson, SQLDB. And I don't have to include connection strings portion of it when it's in the connection strings area of app service. In other words, I could just call it Munson SQLDB and then copy in the value for it. Paste it in, say it's Azure SQL, OK, and there I have it. Save it, and then I'll update it, and what I'll do is that I will stop and then restart the web service once it's been updated. Stop. And then I can restart it. And then, when I go back here, once I hit refresh a couple times, the service will become available, and then I can see it. All right, here we go. I'm up on Azure. I am seeing all of my products. I go into Dill Pickles. I can see my new review. Let's add a brand new one. Another new review from Azure. Save it, or refresh it, and I can see that it showed up. Great. We have now our Blazor server app talking to Azure SQL deployed up onto an Azure SQL, or an Azure app service, and we're up and running. In the next episode, we are going to start adding in Azure Blob Storage so we can have some images to go along with our pickles and preserves.